Daf Yomi, Tractate, Bava, page 114, at the top of the page, with the words Apuma Dechad, Bechule. Based on the word of one witness, which is insufficient evidence according to Jewish law, and we said that this is so only when one individual testifies alone against his fellow Jew. But when two witnesses testify against a Jew, we do not excommunicate them, as their testimony is sufficient evidence according to Jewish law as well. And they have not caused the defendant any unjustified financial loss, even according to halakha. And in the case of a single witness also, we said that we excommunicate him only if he testified in a court of villagers. But if he testified in the official government courthouse, he is not excommunicated. This is because they also prescribe an oath to the defendant based on the testimony of a single witness, but they do not expropriate money in accordance with Jewish law. The Gemara relates that Rav Ashi said, "When I was in the academy of Rav Huna, the following dilemma was raised before us. What is the halakha with regard to an important person whose testimony is relied upon by the Gentile courts, as if it were the testimony of two witnesses? Since the Gentile court will expropriate money based on his word, should the halakha be that he should not testify? Or perhaps, since he is an important person, he cannot escape the authorities to demand his testimony, and he may therefore testify?" The Gemara concludes, "The dilemma shall stand unresolved. Teku." And this would probably be the 140th Teku in Talmud Bavli, according to the book of Rabbi Aaron Yehoshua Pessin, who wrote a book called Teku. He compiled all the unresolved questions in Talmud Bavli, and he wrote a Sofer called Teku, in the Sofer called Teku. And I've been counting all the Tekus along with his Sofer as we are going through Shas. I think the last Teku was 139, and now we've reached 140. Amar Rav Ashi said, the Gemara cites another situation where a Jew is excommunicated for causing harm to another Jew. Rav Ashi said, in the case of a Jewish man who sells a Gentile a plot of land that is on the border of the property of his fellow Jew, we excommunicate him. What is the reason? If we say it is because he has ignored the right of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor to be the first one offered the purchase of the field, but doesn't the master say with regard to one who purchases land from a Gentile and the one who sells land to a Gentile, there is no right of one whose field borders the fields of his neighbor to be the first one offered the purchase of the field? Rather, it is because we say to him, on behalf of the owner of the adjacent field, you have placed a lion, in other words, a dangerous individual, on my border, as the Gentile might now cause me harm. Consequently, we excommunicate him until he accepts upon himself responsibility for all harm that comes upon the neighbor due to the Gentile's activities. Mishnah, new Mishnah. If customs collectors took one's donkey and gave him a different donkey that was taken from another Jew in its stead, or if bandits took his garment and gave him a different garment that was taken from a Jew in its stead, these items are now his because the owners despaired of retrieving them when they were stolen, and they may therefore be acquired by another. In a case of one who salvages items from a river, or from a troop of soldiers, or from bandits, if the owners of the items despaired of retrieving them, they are his. In other words, they belong to the one who salvaged them. And so too, with regard to a swarm of bees, if the owner despaired of retrieving the bees, they are his. In other words, they belong to the one who found them. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka said, a woman or a minor whose testimony is not generally accepted by the court is deemed credible to say it was from here that this swarm emerged, and it therefore belongs to a certain individual. And one may walk into another's field in order to salvage his own swarm of bees that has relocated here, and if he damaged some property in the process, he must pay for what he has damaged. But if the bees settled on a branch of a tree, he may not cut off the other's branch in order to take the bees, even on the condition that he will later give him the money for it. Rabbi Ishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, says, he may even cut off the branch and later give him the money for it as compensation. Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that one who is given an item by a customs collector or a bandit may keep the item. It was taught in a brayta, if he took a donkey from the customs collector, he must return it to the original owners. The Gemara explains the Tana of this brayta holds that the despair loan does not affect legal acquisition. Consequently, the customs collector did not acquire the donkey, and it initially came into the possession of the individual to whom the customs collector gave it illegally, and he is therefore required to return it to the original owner. And there are those who say that the brayta means that if he wants to act beyond the letter of the law and comes to return it voluntarily, he should return it to the original owners. But he's not required to return it. What is the reason that he's not required to return it? It's because the spare alone affects legal acquisition, and the donkey was therefore acquired by the Jew when the customs collector gave it to him. Nevertheless, if he said, I do not want to accept money that is not mine, he returns it to the original owners. The Mishnah teaches that if customs collectors or bandits replaced one's item with one taken from another Jew, these items are now his because the owners despaired of retrieving them when they were stolen. In this regard, Rav Ashi says that they taught that the owners certainly despaired of recovering their property only when it was stolen by a Gentile bandit, but if it was taken by a Jewish bandit, no. The owner did not necessarily despair of recovering it. This is because the victim of the theft might reason, tomorrow I will take him to court and force him to return what he stole. Rav Yosef objects to this. On the contrary, the opposite is more reasonable. When dealing with Gentiles who judge a case and impose their verdicts with force, he does not despair because he realizes that the Gentile court will enforce the law. By contrast, when dealing with a Jew, since Jewish courts merely pronounce a verbal decision but do not have the authority to enforce it, the victim despairs of recovering his property. Rather, if Rav Ashi's distinction was stated, it was stated with regard to the latter clause of the Mishnah, which states, in the case of one who salvages an item from Gentiles or from bandits, if the owner is despaired of retrieving it, the one who finds it may keep it. The Gemara infers, if it is known that the owner is despaired of retrieving it, yes, the finder may keep the item. But in an unspecified situation, where it is not known whether the owner is despaired, the finder may not keep the item. Concerning this, Rav Ashi said, They taught this only when the item was stolen by a Gentile bandit, because the Gentile court judges a case and imposes its verdict with force, and therefore it cannot be assumed that the owner's despair. But if the robbery was committed by a Jewish bandit, since the Jewish courts merely pronounce a verbal decision but do not have the authority to enforce it, the victim despairs of recovering his property. Apropos, the discussion with regard to an owner's despair of retrieving a lost or stolen item, the Gemara notes that we learned in a Mishnah there, Kalim 26:8, with regard to hides that are tanned by the owner himself, the thought renders them susceptible to ritual impurity. Hides and leather are susceptible to contracting impurity only if they are in a finished state. If a private individual uses a piece of hide or leather for a certain purpose, for example as a cot or a tabletop, and decides that this will be its fixed purpose, it is considered a finished product and is susceptible to contracting impurity. But with regard to hides belonging to a leather worker, thought does not render them susceptible to ritual impurity, since this individual sells leather to others. When he uses a piece of leather for a household purpose and decides that this will be his fixed purpose, it is not considered a finished state, as he is likely to change his mind and sell the leather to one who will process it further and put it to a different use. The Mishnah continues. If the hides are those of a thief who has stolen them from another, the thief's thought renders them susceptible to ritual impurity. If they are those of a robber, his thought does not render them susceptible to ritual impurity because he is not considered the owner of the hide. The difference is that, unlike the case of a thief who steals items stealthily, the identity of a robber who takes them item openly is known to the owner, and he harbors hope of finding him and getting the item back. Consequently, he does not despair of recovering his property. Rabbi Shimon says that the matters are reversed. In the case of a robber, the robber's thought renders them susceptible to ritual impurity. If the hides are those of a thief, thought does not render them susceptible to ritual impurity because the owners have not despaired of recovering them, and the thief has not acquired the hide. Rabbi Shimon's reasoning is that a robber who seizes items brazenly is a more difficult criminal to apprehend and bring to justice than a thief. Okay, how are we doing on time? Let's see here. The Gemara analyzes the scope of the dispute between Rabbi Shimon and the first Tana. Ula says that this dispute is only with regard to an unspecified case where it is unknown whether or not the owner is despaired. But where it is known the owner is despaired, all agree that their despair affects illegal acquisition. By contrast, Rabba says, even in cases where it is known that the owner is despaired, there is also a dispute, because although the owner may have expressed despair verbally, he may still hope to retrieve the item. Abaye said to Rave, do not disagree with Ula. Okay, we'll stop here. From Abaye said to Rava, do not disagree. We'll stop here. We'll continue on at a different time.